All right. I'll start once again. Good morning. This is Hybrid Resources Phase 2B training for the pre-market. The deployment is scheduled for November 1st. My name is Cynthia Hinman, and I'm going to be leading this session. Heidi Carter is going to be your producer, and she's going to be monitoring the chat for questions and raised hands and things like that, and let me know so that I can address your questions. I'm also going to have subject matter experts on the phone and available on the line in case I can't answer any of those questions. I'll be here to help me out. So welcome. All right, let's get started. Make sure to keep yourself muted. I'm hoping that all of you have all your phones on mute unless you have a question. Otherwise, we could get feedback or distractions, and we just have a lot to get through, so we want to make sure that we have some quality sound. And if you do have a question, you can ask it either over the phone or the chat. You can raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and Heidi will let me know. Or you can actually just type your question in the chat, and we'll get to it. We're going to have breaks throughout to address questions. We do have a lot to get through today, so I am going to just continue on, and hopefully we will make it through. Here's what we're going to talk about in today's session. First, we're going to cover the background of the Hybrid Resources Project and what we've accomplished so far, what's going to be included in the current initiative, and what's coming next. Next, we're going to jump into some updates for the NRI process. That's the new hybrid projects box that you see there. And I'm going to show you how these processes will be updated. The third section we're going to go through is the remainder of the enhancements associated with Hybrid Resources Phase 2B. Then I'm going to show you some reports and displays that are going to have changes. We'll walk through the market sim scenarios, and then we'll have a wrap up. You can see I have times associated with each one of these sections. They may take longer or shorter. This is just my estimate of how we're going to get through all this material. So again, just estimates, but we'll try and keep on track here. Let's start with some background. So Hybrid Resources Phase 1, that was the first phase. The production was December of 2020. And that allowed individual resources with potentially different SCs and technologies to share a common point of interconnection to the grid. It introduced the Aggregate Capability Constraint, the ACC, which is a constraint that limits a set of co-located resources that share a common min and max. In Phase 2, this was an effort to enhance the capabilities for resources that are considered hybrids or co-located. We split this project into 2 phases, and you'll see we actually have split it into 3 phases now. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Phase 2A, we implemented that high sustainable limit and allowed these types of resources to provide ancillary services. Phase 2B, which is what we're going to cover today, is where we're implementing the master and subordinate aggregated capability constraint and implement the hybrid dynamic limit functionality. There are various changes to applications, reports, and displays, and we're going to go through that in our training today, and that's scheduled for production November 1st of 2022. I also want to let you know that there is going to be a hybrid Phase 2C as well. And in that, we're going to be producing an updated external BRS, which is going to be coming out soon. I don't have a date for that yet. The main update, the main difference in this update is that it concerns the RIMS short-term forecasting BRQs, and they're going to be moving to that Phase 2C. Again, I don't have a date, but I anticipate there will be a market sim scenario and some additional training. So more to come on that. So the first thing I want to do is just define some terms. So when I said that phase 2B, we would be covering master and subordinate ACC, I just kind of wanted to go through what that means. So here is an example of, first of all, a standalone aggregate capability constraint. I have a hard time saying that. The first ACC, this type, is one that exists today. We're going to start calling it standalone to distinguish it from what's coming next. And it represents one ACC with no other ACCs below it. So in this example that you see here, there are 4 co-located resources behind the point of interconnection that can handle a maximum of 233 megawatts. That's the limit at that point of interconnection. An ACC was set up to ensure that no more than 233 megawatts could be dispatched for any combination of these resources at once. So now there's another situation where there is an ACC at the point of interconnection, but there's some additional contractual limitations related to how these resources can be dispatched. In this case, the SC, the scheduling coordinator, might want to set up a master ACC with subordinate ACCs. And we call that master and sub ACC. So let's take a look at an example of that. So in this example, we have one generating facility with 4 co-located resources. At the point of interconnection, the point of interconnection to the facility is 233 megawatts, like the last example. The resource owner has contracted with 2 off-takers. The first off-taker, the one on the left, receives 110 megawatts of the solar resource and 55 megawatts of the storage resource. The second off-taker on the right contracts of 123 megawatts of solar and 62 megawatts of the storage. So the market is going to look at each resource individually. However, the master ACC constraint will limit the production to 233 megawatts, just like it does today. But in addition, the sub-ACC for the resource on the left will limit their production to 110 megawatts, and the second sub-ACC on the right will limit the 2 resources to 123 megawatts. The master ACC limits the combined output of all 4 resources is no more than the studied interconnection of the 233 megawatts, and the subordinate represents those contractual limitations that I mentioned. In the next section, we're going to talk about how a new co-located resource registers to set up these types of configurations. So I'm going to stop right there and see if there are any questions. Heidi, do we have any questions or any hands raised?
This time I don't see any hands raised, and I don't see any questions that have come into the chat at this time. Just a note to everyone, if you're going to put in chat questions, please be sure to post them to everyone. If you send them to Cindy directly, then she might not be able to see those, and we can't address those. So if you do have any questions, please post them to everyone, and we can follow up. And also you can, click next to your name to raise your hand if you do want to speak up. But like I said, I don't see any questions at this point. Oh, I do have one from Matt Thorson, AES Clean Energy. He asks, can you please discuss how resource IDs will be assigned for the hybrid approach?
Thank you. If I can defer that question until we get to the generator resource data template, you're going to see how those are set up. Would that be all right?
Yeah, that works. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Any other questions?
I do have one that just came in from Vanessa, probably going to say it wrong, Clapow. Is metering for these types of setups going to be addressed in this presentation?
Yes, it will.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Okay, and Heidi, thank you for bringing up those good points. I cannot, if you send a chat message to me directly, I will not see it. So I'm not ignoring you if you send them to me. I can't see them the way my setup is set up right now. So, all right, I'm going to continue on. The next set of slides is going to cover the current interconnection process to streamline the process for connecting these new types of resources. So first, we'll talk about the interconnection process, interconnecting to the grid. So one of the first steps in connecting a hybrid resource to the ISO grid is to complete an interconnection request. Once this has been awarded, customers will need to complete a project details form to get the resource IDs for their project, and the information from the project details form and the generator resource data template, or GRDT, will be used to populate the master file. So we're going to talk about what's changing with these different forms and processes: the updated interconnection request form, the updated project details form, and the new hybrid components tab in the GRDT. If you really have questions about the interconnection process as a whole, there is information on our website, and I have a link down at the bottom, and I highly recommend that you attend the next Resource Interconnection Fair, and we're going to be having that in the first quarter of 2023. So stay on the lookout for information about that. All right, let's talk about changes to the interconnection request. So the interconnection request form is submitted to the ISO to allow the ISO to evaluate requests and determine the megawatts that are going to be awarded. This form will be updated with drop-down boxes to facilitate submission of hybrid information. The slide that we have here is a mock-up of what the form will look like. The items in yellow are the specific changes. You'll be able to select the gen type and fuel type from a drop-down, and then enter the megawatt quantity and check whether it's supposed to be a co-located resource or hybrid. So right now, if you're familiar with that form, it has, I believe it has everything listed separately. Now we're kind of streamlining it so that you have drop-down boxes to make those selections. You'll also notice the other box below, and that will allow you to enter additional generation if you have it, more than just those 3 units. And it also is a free-form field in case there's a technology that's not listed in the drop-downs. So that's what that is for. Of course, the rest of the interconnection request form is going to need to be completed and submitted as usual. So those are the changes to the interconnection request. I guess it's a request form. And now we'll take a look at the project details form. So here you have a project details form. This form is the one that's used for RIMs for projects in the ISO Balancing Authority. If you're working on submitting a request for hybrid resource, in this case, you will select non-generation, and I have it there in the drop-down box. It's highlighted. So section 1 of the project details form, you would select non-generation. Next, we'll take a look at, and this is the same area, section C of that form. Section 3C is where a customer will provide the details for their resource. First, you would select the proper configuration, and again, there's a drop-down here, and you would check whichever one that you will be adding. And then we also, you'll complete the rest of this. And because we streamlined this area of the form, we removed a box from section G of the form. So I just wanted to mention that if you remember seeing a checkbox that's not there yet, well, we made it so that it's included in the area C. Okay, we're going to move on to the generator resource data template, the GRDT. So the generator resource data template is a spreadsheet with the characteristics for each resource. And we're interested in the hybrid components tab, which is new. You can see up in the top left or top right there, the hybrid components tab, is what we're going to be talking about today. The resource tab is one that exists already. I'm not going to show it to you. I might mention it here and there as we discuss this. But I did want to go through the columns in the hybrid components tab. So first of all, some of my explanations are going to be in blue, which means that the master file team is going to be adding that information. And then in green, those are things that are modifiable by the customer. So for instance, hybrid in column A is the name of the resource. And you can see in this example, the resource is called example_2_hybrid. It's just the name I made up. But you'll see that there's also a component ID. And that's where you're going to list the individual components of that hybrid resource. You can see that the first two examples here are solar, and then the third one is a battery. The fuel type is in column C, so you're going to enter that in there. The first two, as you can see, say solar, and the third one is LESR. And then the Gen Tech type is a specific technology used for each particular component. In the Resources tab, which is not shown here, when you put in the hybrid, that fuel type that you'll enter on that page would be HYBD for the overall hybrid resource. And then the Gen Tech type on that form will be other, OTHR. You can always look at the instructions for the hybrid, our GRDT to get more information. Columns E and F are the max gen and min gen, so that will be the PMIN and PMAX of those resources. It's similar to other tabs on the GRDT. The resource tab has these as well. So it's nothing new. This next slide has more of the columns. I couldn't fit them all on the same page. You'll notice the columns A and B have the same resource ID and component names, but now we're just looking at the columns that are further to the right. So the first one is the VER NGR column, and it identifies that the component is a VER. Y states that it is a VER, a variable energy resource, for solar, and N would indicate that it is something else. And also there could be a Q in that column. The Q means that the variable energy resource is going through evaluation with the forecast provider. Presumably this would change to a Y after 30 days. The forecast selection can be ISO or SC, and SC means that the scheduling coordinator is self-providing that forecast. We're going to talk more about that. That is a piece of hybrid resources phase 2B. So we're going to get into that particular thing in a little bit more detail later. The next column is DISP, or the dispatchable flag, which will have a yes or no depending on whether it can be dispatched in real time. This column is used for EFC calculations, effective flexible capacity, and that is used for RA. So it's used to determine what quantity can be used for flex RA. The next two columns are the energy limit max, let's see, and the continuous energy limit for the battery components. So basically they're the state of charge, minimum and maximum state of charge. The energy efficiency represents the percentage of charging energy that a battery component can store and discharge later. So these are also columns that exist today in other tabs. Again, the green are ones that are modifiable by the customer, by the scheduling coordinator, and submitted.
Cindy, before we move on, could we go back? We were starting to get quite a few questions, so I wonder if you wanted to address those at this time before we go too much further.
Yep. Well, I just have one more slide, and then there are time for questions. So let's just let me just one more slide.
Great, thanks.
So action items for this section. We want to use the updated interconnection request form and submit it via RIMS. And then there will be the updated project details form if you have a new hybrid resource after 11.1. So you're going to be using the new form with the new fields. And again, there's the GRDT. If you're a new customer, that's going to be submitted through RIMS. And if it's an update, if you're an existing resource, you would use your master file EUI. So you can update the modifiable fields as necessary. And if you see something with the non-modifiable fields that needs to be updated or you have concerns, you can send an email to rdt@caiso.com. So thanks for letting me get through that. And now I will stop for questions. Thanks.
All right, we have quite a few questions in the chat. One that started with Bora Akil from Trimark. Bora, did you want to go ahead and ask these questions? Because I see that you have a couple.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. I actually have just one question in two pieces, I guess. First of all, I want to thank the California ISO for having this training. Definitely appreciate it. And it's great to see, you know, I started working on hybrid resources in 2017, attending all the work group meetings, and it's amazing how far we have gotten in the last 5 years. So thank you very much. Okay, so I have one question. In one of the forms that you were showing, there was like the typical, you know, you have your hybrid, you have your co-located, but then you had hybrid co-located. I think it's a couple slides back. And I wanted to ask what you mean by that. I thought a resource could either be hybrid or co-located, but not both.
Okay, good question. Is it the project details form or the interconnection?
One slide back, I think. Yeah, this one. Do you see? Oh, wait. Go forward. One slide and one more on the configuration. Do you see at the bottom you have a single hybrid co-located and hybrid co-located? I'm just wondering what that hybrid co-located is, because it kind of seems like it's mutually exclusive.
You know, that's a great question, and I also see that it's misspelled. I see that Mike Turner is on the line, and he raised his hand, so I'm assuming, Mike, that you'd like to chime in there.
Sure, Cindy, will do. So the answer to the question is you can have hybrid resources that are co-located with other resources. That's why that option's out there. You can have single fuel resources that are co-located, and you can also have hybrid resources that are co-located with other resources.
So it's kind of nested, if you will.
So let me kind of read that back to you, make sure I understood that correctly. So let's say we have a substation that has been in existence for the last 10 years. And basically you had already 8 existing resources that were VER, variable resources. Now you're adding, let's say, some hybrid resources or co-located resources to that. And if you were filing for that, then you basically use this option called hybrid co-located?
Right, so you can either add a hybrid resource at a given substation, you can add a resource to be co-located, or you could choose to add a hybrid resource that is going to be co-located at that location. Those different options are meant to help communicate your intention with us, and ultimately we may even follow up with you to confirm we're on the same page in terms of what you're trying to accomplish.
All right, thank you very much, Mike.
You're welcome.
Okay. I also noticed that Deb Levine, you had your hand raised. Did you want to add something?
Oh, Mike took care of it. We're good.
Oh.
Hi, Deb.
Okay,
good
thanks.
to talk to you again.
Cindy,
Okay.
we do raised by Mark Crescenthi. so Mark, if you wanted to, or Crescenti Mark, I'm not sure if I'm saying it the right way, but if you would like to ask your question now.
Yes, yes, you got it right. Hi.
Thank you.
Hi, Cindy. So your other next slide, I had the same question if the resource is hybrid or co-located. So I'm okay. So I'm given to understand a single resource can have multiple registrations. But my primary question is on the next slide, where you have the GRDT definitions. Please help. I'm kind of confused with how you define. In the very first slide, you gave us an example of a solar resource of 110 megawatts and a battery resource of 55 megawatts, which become like a sub ACC limit, right? Like they are like subordinates of. That's kind of like a hybrid resource, correct?
Right.
I don't see that being translated here, so I'm confused. Like, which is the master and which is the which is the the subordinate one?
So first of all, so there's another tab that's not displayed here, the resources tab, and in that resources tab, in this example, I would assume that there would be a resource ID of example _2_hybrid1, and on the resources tab, we would identify this as the master. And we would do that because in the fuel type on that tab would say hybrid, HYBD. And then you would come over to this tab and now you're getting the information for the components of that resource, which are the 2 solars and the battery.
Okay. Okay, so then going by your definition, then there should be 2 batteries here, right? Because in your first slide, you have 2 batteries and 2 solar resources. So I'm assuming there is one more row 5, which is for the battery resource, correct?
So just first to be clear, this example is not related to my previous example of master and sub. This is just I just wanted to show you how to fill out the form. So it could be that there's a line 5, 6, 7, and 8. But in this example, I'm just showing you an example of the first 3. There doesn't necessarily have to be a corresponding battery for every solar resource.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Heidi, do we have any other questions?
Yes, we do. And we've got one from Justin. So Justin, I don't know, from Trimark, I didn't know if you wanted to ask the question verbally or if you'd like me to read it for you in the chat.
Either is fine.
Okay, if you want to go ahead and speak up, that would be great.
Sure. Justin Stevenson with Trimark Associates. My question was, we've got some projects in the NRI process right now, bucket 3. Are these projects that are in NRI going to be applicable to filling out the new GRDT, or is this going to be just new projects going forward?
So you're asking if you're going to have to do something for your existing projects? Is that?
Yeah, the existing projects if applicable here.
Yeah, my understanding is that our team here at the ISO is going to update the existing ones, and Mike or Jay, if that is incorrect, please raise your hand and let me know. But that's my understanding is we're going to take care of those ones that already exist, and then you should check them out and make sure they look correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We do have one other question that was posed by Tara Jen. I don't know if you want to ask that verbally or if you'd like me to ask it for you in the chat or.
Heidi, why don't you just go ahead?
Yep. It says in the DISP set to Y, is the DISP set to Y for curtailable solar, dispatching downward direction, but not the upward direction?
Let me take a look at my notes on that. Hold on just a moment. It says the DISP or dispatchable flag will have a Y or N depending on whether it can be dispatched in real time to be increased or decreased, increased or curtailed via the ISO dispatch to supply or consume energy. Hopefully does that answer the question? And if not, please follow up on that.
Does that help, Zach? He doesn't have a mic, so yep, sounds good. Thank you. We do have a hand raised as well. Harsheen Raman. Oh, I don't know if you were speaking or your hand came down. All right. Looks like it came down. So,
sorry, that was my mistake. I don't have any questions.
Oh, okay. Vanessa did have another question. And Vanessa, I don't know if you want to ask it out loud about the date for the updated project details form. Will it be posted and when will it be required for creating a new project? And that's the same for the GRDT.
So my understanding,
when is that going to be posted, and when will a dead date be for creating new projects for these configurations be required?
okay. My understanding is they're going to be ready for 11/1, but when they're going to be posted, I guess I'm not sure. Can either Deb or somebody on the project team help out with the estimated date of when these are going to be available? If it's not 11/1.
Cindy, this is Mike. I don't know that we have a definitive date when we will post that, but it may be that we can post it shortly before the go live, and it would need to be used for any projects that are submitted with the effective date of this initiative being implemented.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for that. We do have another question that came in from Michael Volk. Would you like to ask your question, Michael?
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. Yeah, I was just wondering on the forecast selection header, why is this completed by the master file team and not modifiable by customer? I thought that the scheduling coordinators have this choice.
So I'm going to guess at the answer here, and then I do have more information later about how to change it. And I think it's probably because they're going to be getting that information from other forms, and so they will be inputting that when they get that information. And when we talk about the ISO or SV forecast selection, we'll talk about how you actually request that.
Good, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. And one more question from Igor. Did you want to go ahead and ask your question from AES?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, guys. I'm more interested in how we operate the projects once we go into commercial operations. And it's a little confused between hybrid and co-located, but ultimately for this, what you're explaining here, are we gonna have distinct set points that come from the CalISO rig? And would we get distinct set points, ADS dot certificates and set points as well?
I'm going to go over something called dynamic limits. That's going to talk about how you bid versus what you're capable of. So that's one thing I'm going to talk about. And then secondly, we'll talk a little bit about the metering, which is going to be at the component level. And I don't know if maybe one of those two topics might answer your question. And if not, I'll turn to my experts to try and clarify. Is that fair?
Hand raised from Debbie Levine.
All right.
What's going to happen is that if it's a co-located resource, it will have a resource ID. If it's a hybrid resource, that will have a separate resource ID. So in the hybrid resource, let's say it consists of both solar and battery combined. So you'll get set points based on the resource IDs as part of both you'll have to bid each resource ID separately, and you'll go ahead and get set points based on the resource IDs.
So hybrid is the distinct version where we get the separate ones when it's hybrid, but not when it's co-located?
No, a co-located resource will have a resource ID. So let's say you've got 5 solar plants and 1 solar plant with a battery associated with it. So you would have 6, in essence, resource IDs for that project. Each one of the solar plants will get its own dispatch, its own set points, information from ADS as to where it's supposed to be. The hybrid will also get the same information based on the bid for the hybrid resource, and it'll be dispatched through ADS separately from the other 5 solar portions of the project. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that whole example that you're talking about, that shows a co-located set of sites. You had 5 PV sites and 1 PV BESS site. That's the co-located example, right?
Co-located, yeah.
Okay. And the rig would send just as many set points as there are those. Okay.
Yep, you'll need a set point for each resource ID.
Do you guys have examples yet of the CalISO rig spreadsheets for these kind of technologies? AC coupled and DC coupled sites primarily? And is any of that available to be shared? Or do we have to just go through the process and work with the EDAS team on that? So we have a lot of these projects, and it would just help to have an idea of what to expect from EDAS.
Yeah, I'd have to turn that over to Mike Turner or somebody from the EDAS team.
I see that Priyanka raised her hand. Priyanka, can you jump in?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so the telemetry points are not changing, or there are no new additions as part of hybrid 2B. As individual projects have their own specific characteristics, the points may vary depending on that particular hybrid or co-located resource. When we work on that project, we will send you the telemetry database points.
Okay, thank you very much, Priyanka.
Thank you. Heidi, how many more questions do we have? I think we need to move on.
Actually, I want to mention real quick for anyone interested, Trang Vo put in a link to the GRDT version 17 and GRDT and RDT definitions version 17 drafts. So there's a link to that information, and I believe that Mike Turner already answered the question for Vanessa about hybrid having 1 resource ID, but a co-located has 2 if it has resources underneath it. So Mike, I think your question that says correct, each resource ID gets its own dot. Is that an answer to Vanessa's question?
It was actually just for the overall questions we've had here recently regarding DOTs, whether it's hybrid or co-located. The market sends out a DOT for each resource ID, regardless of if it's single fuel or multi-fuel.
Does that answer your question, Vanessa?
Yeah, that works. I just wanted to clarify.
Great. Okay. Yep. That's the end of the question. So you can go ahead and move along, Cindy.
All right. Great questions. And thank you, everybody, for your questions and the responses. I really appreciate it. All right. We're going to move on to the bulk of the enhancements next. So first thing, we're going to talk a little bit about requesting that master and sub ACC. The first question is, why would I want to do this? Well, it's used in situations where there's contractual limitations on components that are subordinate to the ACC at the interconnection. So the main reason SC might have multiple off-takers for co-located resources, and they need to impose certain limits on the production. And here's my example here at the bottom, just a picture of that. I'm just going to go over some action items if you are interested in doing this. If you feel that this kind of arrangement works for you, if you are in the ISO balancing authority, you're going to need to prepare a PGA or update your existing PGA, and that's going to go to our contracts department, and then it'll be disseminated out to all the departments, and we'll get that set up for you. If you're a WEIM participant, you're going to include this information in your SC letter. So then that will start the process. And if you're an existing resource and you want to set up this type of arrangement, if you're a WEIM participant, we're going to have you submit a city ticket to kick it off. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now we're going to go to something completely different and talk about that SC forecast selection. So that's, if you're a hybrid customer, you can choose to submit your own forecast data via the ISO or your own forecast. So this isn't really only limited to hybrid customers, and it's really not new. Currently, if you're submitting your own forecast, that's done through Cyber, and it's going to be, we're moving that process over to ALFS. So as a result of the hybrid phase 2B, SCs for those hybrid resources will have the option to submit their own forecast rather than the ISO's forecast. And you can do that now through Cyber, but after implementation, it will be done through ALFS. Actually, I just said that. So if SCs for hybrid resources use this feature, you will not be assessed the forecast fee. So in charge code 701. So let's, I have some other notes about the details of that if you want to know about that, but this is generally the fact that you can choose to submit your own forecast for a hybrid resource. So let's talk about how we set that up. If you want to provide your own forecast and you are a new customer, a WEIM participant, you would do this during the onboarding process. And then also ISO BAA participants have the opportunity to request this during the NRI process. So that's why it then ends up on the GRDT, because we're gonna get that information from you, and then we'll put it on the GRDT, and you can modify it. If you are an existing customer and you already want to switch your forecast options, you should submit a city ticket to do that, and we'll kick that off for you. And if you're going to be submitting that information, you're going to do it through ALFS. And this is a picture of our developer site. The technical specs for submitting information can be found on our developer site. And that is on the ISO. If you're on the ciiso.com and you look at the bottom of the page, you'll see there's an option for the developer's site. And if you don't have access, you'll sign up, and on the first page there's a sign in, and you'll get access to that. But you need to request it. Basically, customers who use this feature who are currently using the feature are going to be changing the endpoint of submitting the forecast from Cyber to ALFS. And again, the technical specifications will provide those details. And you can see here, I took a little screenshot of the tech specs for ALFS. You can see the third one down has that ALFS SC ver interface specification coming in fall. So let's talk about some action items if you want to do this. If you want to, if you're a new customer and you would like to be submitting your own forecast, you're going to be doing that through your onboarding process. And if you are an existing customer, you're going to submit that request through City. And again, you're going to start submitting that forecast through ALFS and not the way we currently do it, which is in Cyber. So I'm going through a bunch of different small features, and at the end, I'm going to stop and see if there are questions. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about are the dynamic limits. Okay, so what are they? The dynamic limits are the minimum and maximum megawatts for hybrid resources that can be submitted for every 5-minute interval. And what they do, as it says here on the screen, they enable the scheduling coordinator to limit the dispatch instruction of the ISO for positions of bid curve that are unavailable for dispatch based on actual production limitations of the resource. I would also add that it's also available to extend the dispatch instructions above the bid curve if they're actually available for more megawatts. So you're going to submit those through Cyber or through the API, again, just like you would do the forecast option. So we're going to take a look here. First, we're going to do an example. So here, hybrid resources that are modeled as a single unit, but each underlying unit could have its own operating challenges. And since the operation of each resource is managed by the SC and submitted as a single bid, there needs to be a way to let the ISO know the operating capabilities of the resource within each hour. So that way the ISO is going to ensure that the dispatch is correct and feasible. So in this example that I'm showing you here, let's say at whatever hour this is of the day, the storage component of this hybrid resource does not have sufficient state of charge to produce any megawatts. But the solar resource typically provides 25 megawatts in this hour. So there's a bid in there for 25 megawatts for this hour. And on the day of this hour, the forecast shows that there's clouds coming during the hour. So the 25 megawatt bid might not be attainable for that entire hour. And the way the ISO, the SC lets the ISO know its capabilities is it's going to submit the dynamic limits as opposed to submitting multiple outage cards. So you can see here at the bottom, I see the dynamic limits showing the resources availability for this particular hour. So for instance, in the first 5 minutes, you can see that the lower limit of this resource is 1 megawatt and the upper limit is 25, exactly what they bid in and what they're available for. But you can see in the second 5 minutes, it seems like they're only going to be available for 23 megawatts. So they do not want to be dispatched for 25 because they can't make that. So that's what this example is showing. Now, I also want to point out that it's possible, as I mentioned before, for the dynamic limits to exceed the economic bid limit and potentially allow for a resource to be dispatched above or below its bid-in amount. So let's look at how you would submit these limits every 5 minutes. You can see on the left side here, again, we're at the developer site and you can use the API and get the technical specifications for Cyber there in the developer site. The other way to submit these is through Cyber, and you can access the Cyber user interface and you can access that through the market participant portal. Let's go through an example of how you would do that through the portal. And again, it's very similar to the way that existing resources are submitting their VER forecasts today. So you would select the new tab called Dynamic Limits. And once you're there, you are going to enter the date and the SCID and press Apply. click on the icon at the top left to create the dynamic limit table. So you're going to click it, and this will open a box that looks like this. You're going to fill in this box. You're going to select a resource. You're going to put in the SCID if it's not already there, and you're going to select a resource from the drop-down. And then you can add a minimum and maximum value in this box to create your dynamic limit. You click Create. And this is what it might look like. So now the table will be populated with the information you entered. So if you need to edit the minimum and maximum limits in any one of those, you can use the pencil icon to edit those limits. Then you're going to click Apply to save the changes. And to submit the information, you're going to click either the double arrow or the triple arrow. The double arrow will submit only the rows that you've selected, and the triple arrow will submit all the dynamic limit information. So that's how you're going to use this user interface to submit dynamic limits. Again, you're going to be doing this for every 5-minute interval. You can see that this table has the status, the resource name, that 5-minute time start, the minimum and maximum limits that you'll be submitting. So for the dynamic limits, if you have one of these types of resources, you're going to be using the Cyber User Interface or the API to submit that dynamic limit information every 5 minutes for your resources. I just have a couple other items to go through, and then I will stop for questions. Somebody asked about metering, and the metering, as Priyanka mentioned, not much has changed except for those meters must be installed at the component level. So we're going to need meters for each component, so that revenue meters, so that we can distinguish between the production of each one of the components under your hybrid.
Are they going to differ between AC coupled and DC coupled? I think that's one of my project's problems right now. There's no guidance on DC coupled systems for a hybrid resource.
Priyanka, do you want to answer that question?
Yes, yeah.
And then,
so the requirement will be the same, that we would need the component level meter data for both DC coupled as well as AC coupled configurations, because the reason behind this component level meter data is for forecasting, for the forecasting data. We would need per megawatt.
Can I jump in here? It's not as easy as you make it sound. In a DC coupled large scale project, this is Bor Akil from Trimark, by the way. In a large scale DC coupled project, you may have 100 inverters, and that's a low number, by the way. You may have 100 inverters and 100 each PV plus best DC meters. So you're going to have 200 meters that we are collecting data from for each of these individual parts of the power conversion system. So just to say that we need it at the component level, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, because do you need all 200 of these meters and you're going to try to sum these up, or you just need basically, and in a DC coupled system, unlike an AC coupled system, you have one pod meter, right? Point of delivery meter. And fundamentally, I'm trying to make sense of this, and it's just not clicking for me.
Yeah, we would need one aggregated value, which can be done under SCME option. So you can have individual inverter values aggregate up and submit the component level per megawatts under SCME option to ISO.
Okay, so are we submitting these as DC megawatts, or you want a conversion to the AC side?
Converted to the AC side.
okay. Maybe there's a detailed technical discussion that needs to happen on this, because I believe that what you're asking for and what you really need are two different things. It's when we first discussed in the hybrid resources working group, the DC coupled, all the charts always had one DC coupled resource, which made a lot of sense. But when you have 100 of these and you have inverters that, you know, out of 12 power modules, 8 of them may be operational, giving you that aggregated DC output, I think is going to be inaccurate. But yeah, I said maybe we can have a detailed technical discussion on that.
I think that's a great. It sounds like we're going to need some additional discussion about that. Are there other comments related to this before I complete the slide?
Yeah, this is Pat McCarthy with AES. I had the exact same concern as Bora, so I just wanted to you know, double down on it or whatever. You know, the biggest inverter I can find, just to use the 233 megawatt example that CalISO started this presentation with. You know, if you had a 5 MVA inverter, which I don't think those are made, that's bigger than available, and only 2 inputs to the low side, then that's approximately 1 DC meter per 2.5 megawatts. And that's not inclusive of all of the substation feeder metering and stuff to further disaggregate, you know, per resource metering from a point of interconnection. So yeah, to Bora's point, we're talking about hundreds of meters, which starts to represent whole percents of project cost. And we would definitely like to get some clarification on that before we go ahead and commit to that kind of metering.
Thank you for that.
Yep.
Priyanka, any comments before we move on?
Yeah, I agree with them. We should have a separate discussion on this topic.
Okay, great. If there's
I see a raise from Mike. Mike, was your hand was raised first? Do you have something you wanted to add about this, or?
I just have a scenario question on the dynamic limit interaction with the forecast, so it's not specific to this slide, so I can wait.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We'll come to you first when we get to our question break. So.
All right, thank you. Okay, I wanted to also mention that, moving on this slide, that hybrid resources are excluded from generic RAME. So if you have a hybrid resource that's used for resource adequacy and it's generic resource, it's going to be excluded from RAME, meaning that it's not going to be subject to the payments or charges associated with RA availability. So I just wanted to pass that along. Also, if you choose to use your hybrid resource and you choose to use your own forecast, your forecast fee will be waived. So in the market sim scenarios, you're probably going to want to check and make sure that that's the case. And also, bids from these resources are not subject to market power mitigation. When we do the NPM run, we're going to look at them, but they will not be mitigated. So now I'm going to open it up for any additional questions.
All right, go ahead, Mike.
Hi, thank you. Cynthia, so can you back up to the slide that included the dynamic limits for each 5-minute interval? Please.
Oh, well, there we go.
Perfect, right there. Okay, so my question has to do with the interaction of the dynamic limit submitted versus the ISO's forecast for the interval. If the dynamic limit, you said if the dynamic limit submitted was higher than the bid quantity, or what would be the forecast, does that create a new bid quantity? Does that replace the forecast as the bid quantity for the interval?
That is my understanding. And actually, there's going to be one of the market sim scenarios will allow you to test that out. So if you actually, in this example, let's say you were available for, you put the bid in for 25 megawatts, a quantity of 25 megawatts, but you're actually available for 26 in one or more of those intervals, and you put that in the dynamic limits, then you could potentially get dispatched for that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the ISO's forecast would establish the dot in ADS, and the dynamic limit, either higher or lower, could trigger a positive or negative sub value for the resource. Is that the way it would be displayed in ADS?
That is my understanding, and if one of my subject matter experts wants to expand on that, I'd appreciate that. Not seeing any hands. That is my understanding. Yes.
Okay, and then yeah, so the market sim scenarios. Obviously, though, if you don't have a hybrid resource, you won't be able to test that out and see it. But if we could get that confirmation, I'm happy to put that in an email or city, I guess. But
sure. Yep, that would be great if you could.
Hey, Mike, this is Gabe Murtaugh from California ISO. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so in the scenario where the ISO's forecast, let's say in interval 1 in this slide, let's say the ISO's forecast was 24 megawatts. The dynamic limit submitted is 25. So will the dot in ADS reflect the ISO's forecast of 24? And then there'll be a positive sub of 1 representing the incremental dynamic limit. And then on the flip side,
yeah,
if your forecast is 24 and we submit a dynamic limit of 23, will we see a dot of 24 and a negative sub of 23? Or negative
so
sub.
just from, I understand the question. So just from a perspective of the ISO, the hybrid resources are not like variable energy resources. The idea is that the market participant for a hybrid resource submits a bid to the ISO, and there is an ability to also submit these hybrid dynamic limits, an upper limit and a lower limit, to tell the ISO or inform the ISO what the upper operating limit of the resource is and what the lower operating resource, the lower operating limit of the resource is. The idea then is that based on market outcomes, so whatever price emerges is going to inform where the ISO dispatches that resource subject to these upper and lower limits. What doesn't impact the market outcome for a hybrid resource is any kind of information about what's going on in the underlying components of the hybrid resource. So if there happens to be cloud cover in real time or forecast, if there happens to be no state of charge in the battery, if there happens to be full state of charge in the battery, none of that's considered by the ISO market optimization. The only thing that's really considered are the bid curves, the actual LMP, and the submitted upper and lower limits. So if you happen to submit an upper limit for this first interval at 25 megawatts, and the actual amount of output from your solar is 24 megawatts, the expectation from the ISO is that you'd be generating 24 megawatts from your solar, and then you'd be making up that other 1 megawatt from the on-site storage resource. Just like all resources, hybrids are required to follow their dispatch instructions from the ISO. So there could potentially be a difference from what's actually going on in the underlying components of the resource and what may have been submitted through the upper and lower hybrid dynamic limits. Does that help to answer the question?
I'm not sure I followed, but so for a hybrid resource, the ISO's 5-minute forecast would not establish a dot.
Correct.
The upper limit would, well, so what what would happen if no dynamic limit were provided?
So just like any like a typical gas resource, if you've got a bid curve submitted to the market, the ISO, depending on what prices emerge at that specific location, could dispatch the resource anywhere along that bid curve. So if you bid to provide 0 megawatts, if prices are, you know, $50 or less, and then, you know, you provide 50 megawatts if prices are above, 75, and actual prices emerge at 90, then we'd send a dispatch instruction to the resource to provide 50 megawatts.
Okay, so just to clarify,
yeah,
so the ISO forecast will not be used to create the bid quantity.
Correct. The ISO forecast in that situation could be 25, it could be 50, it could be 75. We don't care.
And another way of looking at it is that if you have a hybrid resource, you're kind of like a natural gas turbine with a limited gas tank. So you make a bid, CAISO clears the bid, they award the bid to you, you have to generate that energy unless you submit the dynamic limit.
Okay.
Well, and those expectations are always in place. So whatever dispatch instruction a hybrid resource receives from the ISO, our expectation is that those resources will be responding to that dispatch instruction at that level.
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think I may have another question, but I'll put my hand down for now. Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions?
So, we did have a question from Michael Wolf. I don't know if you asked this question verbally or not. I'm sorry if I missed you. I don't know if you want to ask your question about your required horizon for dynamic limit. Do you want to ask that question?
Sure. I was just wondering if it's still 3 hours. Has the horizon changed? Is it required for 3 hours? And also, can scheduling coordinators submit beyond that horizon in advance? Thank you.
Okay. So dynamic limits, we keep a rolling 7 days of dynamic limits, and let's see, for each 5-minute interval, the system will provide scheduling coordinators the ability to submit dynamic limits for hybrid resources, and we shall receive them from scheduling coordinators as upper and lower for a rolling 6-hour window. It's a 6-hour window, not 3.
Okay, great. And can you submit beyond the 6 hours in advance, or it has to be updated every 5 minutes?
That's a good question. I think you can, I mean, when you go into, so you're asking if you can submit more than 6 hours?
That's right.
Advance? I guess I am not certain of the answer to that question, but I know that you can edit them up to 5 minutes before. But does anybody out there, as far as my SMEs, can you answer that question? Can they submit more than 6 hours ahead?
This is Greg Ford. I'm researching that right now. I'm just trying to check what the cyber rules have on that. I'll try to respond back, maybe in the chat, and then that can be relayed back to the person asking the question.
Okay, Greg, do you want to just take a look at that, and then you'll raise your hand again, or just come back on again and let us know the answer?
Yes.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
There was another one from Dak from Terragen, and a very similar question. So Greg, when you're looking at those questions in the chat, could you take a look at the one from Michael and from Terragen and provide an answer on those?
Sure, I can do that.
Great, thank you so much. And then I see that Mike has his hand raised.
I think my hand was raised prior, but I think and I may be asking the same question that I asked before, but if what is the purpose of the ISO forecast for a hybrid if it's being awarded based on the bid submitted, and then the dynamic limit is then setting the new 5-minute economic bid quantity? What is the purpose of the forecast?
So I can try and answer that, and then maybe I will defer to Gabe or someone else. But with hybrid resources, we're looking at that dynamic limit. With co-located resources, we're going to be looking more towards the forecast, right? With the hybrid resources, we don't know what your combination of resource production is behind that, that combination of hybrids. We just know you're submitting a certain amount of megawatts. We don't know how much of it is solar and how much of it is battery per se. So we're looking at that dynamic limit so you can tell us that. Where with like a standalone wind resource, we are looking, then we're using a forecast. Does anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, this is Gabe Murtaugh again from California ISO. I think what you said is right, Cindy. I think to be a little bit more blunt, what we are doing with the forecast right now today, to be perfectly frank, really isn't very much. It's not informing what we're doing in our market. I think we do have on the back end some applications that are going to tie in with what we currently do in our forecasting process, but that is not going to be used in any kind of way with market dispatch instructions or anything like that right now. I think part of the reason why we're collecting this information, though, is potentially in the future as this market and this model evolves, we may start to think about how these different factors could potentially be used to automate what these hybrid dynamic figures look like in the future. But we're certainly not there right now, as this is still a very early new model that we're exploring, and we're trying to figure out how it works and how market participants prefer to model their resources, using the co-located model, the hybrid model. But it was something that we thought could potentially be useful in the future.
Okay, so in the currently, does it make sense that to charge a hybrid participant for the use of your forecast if it's not being utilized?
I think it does if that's what's necessary to get the aggregate hybrid resource to respond to the dispatch instructions coming from the ISO. And I think that's the way that when we first started thinking about the hybrid model, we were really, framing it. This model allows scheduling coordinators to really have latitude to just submit bids to the ISO, and if prices are high, they'll get dispatched. If prices are low, they won't. And then it's really on the scheduling coordinator to kind of manage what's going on under the hood, so to speak. If you want to charge the battery, that's fine. If you don't want to charge the battery, that's fine. But you need to submit bids in such a way to kind of make that output that outcome happen.
And then the dynamic limit allows you to refine that more at the operating interval.
To some extent it does, but the hybrid dynamic limit is really expressing to the ISO what it sort of is replacing like PMIN and PMAX. So PMIN and PMAX tell the ISO what your upper and lower physical operating limits of the resource are. Obviously, if you're operating a hybrid resource and it's a solar component and a storage component and the sun's just not shining, well, there's a significant chunk of capacity that you're not able to generate. So we want you to let the ISO know that. And if the sun's coming up or the sun's going down, obviously those are changing every 5 minutes. So the dynamic limit is the tool that scheduling coordinators can use to express, hey, next interval, don't expect me for a full 100%. I'm only going to be able to deliver 85% because the sun's starting to set and I can't quite get to 100 right now. The next interval, hey, I'm only going to be at 83%, and then it continues on down. And these are the tools that we developed to do that. It doesn't necessarily say, I only want to be dispatched at 83. It's more a statement of, I only can be dispatched at 83. The dispatch is still going to happen based on economics of where prices are and what the bid curves look like.
Okay, so one final question then. If I elect not to use the ISO, or I don't know what I'm doing with the ISO forecast, but am I required to submit my own forecast in addition to the dynamic limit?
I think the answer to that is yes, but I'll turn that back over to Cindy.
Well, you have the option of submitting your own forecast, or the ISO will, the default is that the ISO is going to create a forecast.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering why it's not huge dollars at stake, but it's 10 cents a megawatt hour. So why am I paying for a forecast? And if the forecast isn't used in the market currently, then it seems like it's.
Yeah, I would add that potentially, the forecast, yeah, it's not used in the market, but I think our forecasting department, our short-term forecasting people are using that information in order to refine their forecast. My apologies for the noise in the background. But I believe they are then gathering that data to refine forecasts overall.
Okay, it just doesn't seem like there's a benefit to the participant. That's why I don't see why the charge would apply. You're developing a forecast.
All right. Well, thank you. And point taken. I can see where you're coming from.
Thanks, Cynthia. Thanks again.
Mm-hmm. Heidi, anything else? It looked like Greg put in some information.
You responded to the TerraGen question about the timing. So thank you for putting that in there about Cyber having a cutoff time of 10 minutes prior to the start of the interval, allowing for 2.5 minutes for the data to be validated and sent to the market system. And the market system for the 5-minute kicks off at 7.5 minutes prior to the start of the 5-minute interval. So thanks for putting that in there. And I think I'm going back through. We've got a lot of emails coming in. Thank you very much for all of you for putting your emails in. We do have some hands raised here. The first one that we have raised is Mike, then Bora, and then Greg. So Mike, Mike's went down, so. Bora?
Okay, thank you, Heidi. So I have a question for Gabe. Gabe, if you recall the discussions, one of the reasons why people wanted to go with the hybrid model was the requirement for basically potentially not endangering their ITC, right? Investment tax credit for the battery so that they don't accidentally grid charge. But now that the law has changed basically, and I know there will be guidance coming from the IRS, but do you see anybody and I'm asking you to speculate a little bit here, but do you see any need for the hybrid resource model when the co-located serves just fine and it's much easier for people to understand?
Hey, Bora, good to hear from you again. I think initially when we put these two models together and the proposals for the co-located and the hybrid resources, I think we really did anticipate that, resources that we're trying to capture the ITC may prefer to use the hybrid model, and other resources may prefer to use the co-located model. I think what you're saying is accurate from the actual evidence that we have most resources prefer to use the co-located model, and I think the reason that the preference is there for the co-located model is because it does allow you to have things like the standard features that are available to renewable resources today. The ability to respond to economic dispatches, but also produce quote unquote as capable when prices are materializing as normal. And then also the co-located resources offer the ability for storage to include things like the ISO monitoring state of charge and dispatching the resources based on state of charge, that kind of thing. So with that said, we do have some resources today that are participating with the hybrid model, but the majority are participating with the co-located model. So I do think that some market participants do still think there is some value with the hybrid model, but predominantly people are using the co-located model. So because of that, I would say yes. It's probably fine to have two different models. Could you potentially use just one and get everything you need? It might be possible, and who knows what the direction will be in the future as we get even more storage on the system that could be hybrid or co-located.
Thank you very much.
Does that help at all?
Yeah, it does. You answered my question, and the data is also especially very telling in the way that the participants are choosing majority. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the question.
All right. Are we ready to move on? We have 10 minutes, and
we did.
It looks like we
have a hand
minutes material.
Sorry about that, Cindy. We have a hand raised from Greg.
Okay, let's take that one, and then we need to move on.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought that this was the end of the session and it was the last chance to have questions. I can hold to the end for my questions. Thanks.
Okay, Greg. Thank you. I also noticed that Greg Ford did put additional comments on the bottom if you want to take a look at them regarding the window for submitting your dynamic limits. But I'm going to move on, and if we have some time at the end, we'll definitely come back to it. All right, so let's look at some of the displays that are changing. If you are a WEIM participant and you are a WEIM entity, the BAOP application, the Balancing Authority Area Operations Portal, there is a new screen, a new display called Dynamic Limits, and also there's going to be some new columns and some existing reports. So let's take a look at those. First, in BAOP and coming soon, you'll note that there is the Hybrid Resources Phase 2B selection. In it, there is ACC constraints and the ACC schedules. We'll take a look at those. But there's also the Dynamic Limits report, which has 4 options. If you look at the real-time dispatch, the RTD option, it's going to display your dynamic limits in 5-minute intervals. The RTPD, and we'll take a look at one of the reports, but the RTPD, which is real-time pre-dispatch, that's going to show your dynamic limit data in 15-minute intervals calculated as the average of the corresponding 3 5-minute intervals. Stuck, the short-term unit commitment, this version will look out 4 hours, and it's going to display on a 15-minute basis like the RTPD, the average of the corresponding 3 5-minute intervals. And then RTBS is the real-time base schedules. Again, it's going to do the display the same way with the 15-minute intervals for your dynamic limit data, calculated as the average of the 3 corresponding 5-minute intervals. So let's see, and it's used, I just want to add that it's used in the bid range capacity and the flex ramp sufficiency tests. So let's take a look at what the report looks like. I know this is small, but hopefully if you look at it, the presentation, which is posted, by the way, on the ISO website in 3 different locations. I'll tell you where. You might be able to see it a little bit better, but it should give you a good idea here of what's going on. If you look on the left table, you'll see that the left table on the dynamic limits display is the dynamic limits. So it's going to have your resource ID and each 5-minute interval. This happens to be the RTD selection. And it has the upper and lower limits that were submitted. On the right side of the screen, there's going to be other information about the resources, including the interval end, the same time period, the PMIN, PMAX, and the status. It's also going to tell you what ancillary services are on board and the DOT. So you're going to be able to look at all that type of information together. And so all 4 of the reports will display something like that. Also, the ACC constraints report, which already exists, there's going to be a new column for the master and sub. So you know if the resource is a master, if the ACC is a master ACC or a sub ACC. And if you highlight the master ACC, it will tell you all the sub ACCs that are associated with it. So that is what is new in the ACC constraints report. You'll find the same thing here in the ACC schedules report. We added that same type column. The other information, you won't be able to get the sub information on this one. Like if you click on the master, it won't show the sub information, but it does tell you what each one of these ACCs are, whether they are a master or a sub. Now moving to OASIS. OASIS just generally is our open access same time information system, and it's available, it's public information that's available on CAISO.com. There will be a new ACC constraints shadow price report. I only have a mock-up of it at this time, but this is what it's intended to look like. And it's going to display the shadow prices for binding intervals for the day ahead, 15-minute and 5-minute time frames. This report, maybe, I asked why market participants would use this report, and it could help inform them why LMPs at their location maybe don't reflect with their bid prices. It can give you shadow price information. So that's what you're going to find changed in OASIS. There's also a new report on our market participant portal. The market participant portal that scheduling coordinators use. It provides links to our applications. It also has some reports on it as well. There is one report called Transmission Limits, and that report will be updated. So if you are on the market participant portal, when you go into the market participant portal, the first thing it will show you is the splash page with all the applications, and you can choose which ones you want to look at. But also there is another selection for market participant portal on that page that will take you to a page that looks like this. And this, we're going to be adding ACC limit information to the existing transmission limits report. So if you are in the market participant portal and you have access to market modeling data, which you need an NDA, by the way, to be able to have access to that, a non-disclosure agreement. And the transmission limits report that exists today will also have ACC limit information. I don't have a shot of that report, but if you currently use that report, it will be updated. Next, we're going to move to CMRI. CMRI is the Customer Market Results Interface, and it contains the customer-specific market results and information. There are 2 reports that are going to be impacted. We're going to take a look at these 2, and there's a new report called ACC Definitions. So the Interval Variable Energy Resource Report, which exists today, is going to include the VER component information. And I highlighted that this displays the 5-minute forecast for the VER component. So that's just going to be added into the existing report. The other report that is going to be impacted is the Variable Energy Resource Forecast. Now, in this report, you can see there are 3 options. The first option being day ahead, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It's going to show you the day ahead forecast information. There are 2 other selections, locked hour ahead and rolling hour ahead. The locked hour ahead report for previous trade intervals, it's the forecasts that were used by the market for that interval. And for future intervals, it displays the most recent forecast available, and it uses 5-minute forecast data that are averaged up to hourly. The rolling hour ahead forecast information uses the most recent forecast information that was available on the date and time specified. So it uses the 5-minute forecast averaged up to hourly. So for example, if you have a trade date at a particular hour selected, it would display the latest forecast available for that particular hour for all the hours that that are there. We have one new report that is coming, and it's called the ACC Definition Report. Now, this report is going to provide a list of the constraints. It's going to have the start date and the end date. I don't have a mock-up of it, and we're currently determining where this report is going to live and how it's going to be presented, because of the fact that it could have multiple scheduling coordinators impacted by a particular constraint. We're still trying to determine how we're going to present that and how it's going to, where it's going to live. So it's coming soon, so stay tuned for that. And finally, the ISO today and the today's outlook are going to include our hybrid information. We're going to be updating our existing graphs, the ones that include current supply and current renewables. It's going to include the hybrids. And additionally, we're going to have a completely new graph that will show the hybrids and what the components of the hybrid information are. Also, on today's Outlook and ISO Today, we're going to have a new trend chart for the hybrid resources. That's going to show what the components of those are for the particular hours of the day and the amounts. And we're also going to be updating our existing trend charts that are on the ISO Today and today's Outlook apps today, currently, which include the supply trend, the import trend, the renewables trend report, and the batteries trend report. So those will all incorporate the hybrid data. So I'm going to stop and ask for questions about the reports, if you have any, and then we're going to talk about the market sim. I'm sorry we're going over time a little bit here, but if there are questions, I'll take them, and then we'll talk about the market sim. If you need to jump off, I just want to let you know that the market sim scenarios have been updated recently, so I would encourage you to take a look at them if you don't have time to stick around for the rest of this presentation. All right, any questions about the displays and the reports?
Do you have a hand raised by Mike?
Mike?
Not a question on the reports, but just generally, and I apologize if you mentioned this, but is there a process defined for requesting a new ACC?
Requesting a new ACC?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to see that in, earlier on in the presentation. Are you talking about a master and sub ACC or just?
Right.
Yeah, there are some slides earlier in the presentation, and depending on whether you're a WEIM participant or whether you are in the ISO BAA, I have some notes earlier in the presentation about that.
Cool, I'll go back and look. Thanks.
All right, and by the way, the presentation is posted in 3 different places. You'll find it on the Learning Center, in the new module section. You'll also find it in the initiatives, the policy initiatives page under hybrid resources 2B. And you're also going to find it on the release planning page. So you have plenty of places to look for that presentation. It's available. All right, any other questions?
Greg, I know you had held your question back for later. Did you want to ask your question at this time?
No, I think I've got all my questions that was addressed to me.
Okay, great.
All
there
right.
were follow-up questions and that were asked that are in the chat that are discussing the timing. So I see that Greg is responding to it. So I think that's clarified. So I think, yeah, we're good on that. So at this time, no other hands raised.
All right. So let's finish.
Sorry, can I just ask one question?
Greg. Go ahead, Greg.
I apologize. I didn't. I got on late. I had a conflict come up at the last minute, and I'm very interested in all the contents of the conversation. Is the audio also going to be made available, or will we only be able to get the a download of the presentation?
Absolutely. The audio will be available as soon as I get it. I will make sure I get it posted on the website, so you'll be able to listen to the entire thing.
All right. Thanks.
Oh, sure. All right, so let's go to the market sim scenarios. And if you want to participate in the market sim, you should have already signed up, but I would encourage you, if you still want to participate, we'll get you in if we can. So contact marketsim@caiso.com to register. I'm not going to go through the scenario in the interest of time, but I will tell you that what changed is that if you look at the market sim scenario before, these are unstructured scenarios, so you can really, check whatever you'd like. But the verify the following in CMRI, we gave a little more information about looking at the dynamic limits. I have some recommendations for the market sim scenario 1. I would recommend that you verify the data in the master file for your hybrid resources. Submit bids and submit dynamic limits that either limit or extend the bid limits, and also verify that dynamic limit information. Those bids that were awarded in the market, I would encourage you to go to CMRI and verify the market awards are within those dynamic limits, and verify that the forecast data is published at the VER component level. Also in MRIS, I would review the forecast fee, and if you should have been charged because you're using the ISO forecast, make sure it's there. If you're using the SC's forecast, you should not see that fee. And verify that if you have generic RA, that there is no range settlement for your RA resource. There is another scenario, and it has to do with ancillary services. So recommendations for that one, again, submit ancillary service bids for those co-located resources that are part of a sub-ACC. And if you're using BSAP, if you're a WEIM participant and you're submitting base schedules, again, put in some ancillary services base schedules. And CMRI, you're going to want to verify that everything was awarded appropriately. And in ADS, you're going to want to look at those follow dot flags and make sure they are set appropriately to based on your AS awards. Went through that a little bit quickly, but it's written out pretty well. And I will open it. Actually, I'm going to finish up and then I will open it up for questions. So I'm going to wrap this up. Just to summarize, I know we went through a lot of information. We started with the interconnection process. The interconnection request form has some new fields in it. The project details form has also been updated. You're going to want to take a look at the new hybrid tab on the generator resource data template, the GRDT, where we talked about master and sub ACC configurations and how to set that up and what they are. We talked about forecasts, ISO forecasts and SC forecasts, how to submit dynamic limits through your API and through Cyber. We looked at the BAOP display and the changes there for dynamic limits and some of the existing reports. We also looked at OASIS reports, CMRI reports, the transmission limits report, which is on the market participant portal, and the changes to today's outlook. I also quickly went over the market sim scenarios, which you will be able to see on the release planning page, and I listed my recommendations there. And I also want to encourage you to look out for that new external BRS, version 1.5 that will be coming out. And it's going to talk about what's going to be moved to Hybrid Resources Phase 2C. And with that, I will open it up to any final questions about anything that has to do with that.
I see Greg's hand is raised.
Can't help myself, sorry. Because I got here late, I didn't want to ask questions before I kind of scrolled through the presentation, and I've tried to do that quickly while you were talking. I have just a really specific question about, we've got a resource in the NRI process right now that we're currently planning to be a hybrid resource as opposed to a co-located resource that could change based on the facts on the ground. But we're also DC coupled, and as a result of that, we are not eligible, as we understand it, for CAISO to be a CAISO metered entity, which means we'd be providing settlement quality data and be an SCME. Does that preclude us receiving or participating in CAISO forecasts? It obligates us to get a third-party forecast? Is that a correct understanding?
So Greg, I'm going to direct you to, there was a lot of questions having to do with that particular topic, and we're going to be setting up another meeting to discuss this, I believe.
Right.
So you can probably get in on that and probably get your questions answered.
Okay. Do we have an idea when that will be?
I haven't been able to see the chat, so I'm not sure how we're doing that, but we'll make sure we get to, is there a list of emails, Heidi? How are we?
Yeah, people have been putting in their emails. So for anyone who's interested, we'll take all of your information back and then, to the group so that they can set that meeting up, that technical meeting. So if you are interested and you haven't put your email address in the chat yet, go ahead and throw that in the chat. I've been capturing those, and I'll make sure to get that over to this team so that when that gets scheduled, that they'll make sure that you're all invited.
Thanks, Heidi. I'll add that now.
Great. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you, Heidi. Is there anything else?
We have a hand raised from Chenyu Lo. Go ahead, Chenyu.
Oh, hi. So just curious as when the BRS version 1.5 will be published.
I don't have a date for you, but it's very soon. I know they're in the final stages. I would guess, I don't want to guess, but certainly in the next few days, like early next week or maybe even today or tomorrow. But I can't say for sure. I know that they're working furiously on it right now.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
I don't see any other questions right here. And I put in a couple of links to where you can find the presentations, as Cindy said, in our Learning Center, where the recording will be posted, and to the initiative page for the hybrid resources, as well as to the resource planning page, so or release planning, it should say. So there's a lot of information in there. So there are those links. Greg, I see your hand still up, but I don't know if that was from before. Yep. Okay. No worries. Just want to make sure you're covered. So, so I don't see any other questions, but I see a couple of others. Mike and Greg, I've got your email addresses, so thank you very much for that.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for sticking with me. I thought this was a really great session, great questions. I want to thank all my subject matter experts for helping me out, and I want you all to have a great rest of your day. Thank you.